Hello, this is a lecture on crime related to computer ethics, class CS 4020. So in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about hacking. We'll be talking about cyber attacks, different types and statistics. We'll talk about identity theft and credit fraud. We'll talk about scams and forgeries. Crime fighting versus privacy and civil liberties and the trade-offs within them, and also laws that rule the web. So hacking can be defined as gaining illegal or unauthorized access to a file, computer, or a network. In the early 1960s to 70s, it was actually considered a positive term. A hacker was a creative programmer who wrote elegant or clever code, and a hack was an especially clever piece of code. Moving on to the 70s and 90s, it took on negative connotations when people were breaking into computers for which they didn't have authorized access. It still was primarily individuals, not groups, involved in this. And it included spreading of computer worms and viruses and other kinds of malware that we'll be talking about in this lecture. Companies began during this time, especially in the later period, to use hackers to analyze and improve in security. Beginning in the mid-90s, this is when the web came into being. The growth of the web really changed it. It allowed spreading viruses and worms to spread rapidly. Political hacking, hacktivism surfaced, denial of service attacks to shut down large websites began to occur, and large-scale thefts of personal and financial information just because of the ease of email and other forms of communication on the web and how much it had spread. This possibility increased. But there's also new terms that came into being, like hackathon, which is a get-together to do intensive coding. It has a totally positive connotation. So one thing to ask is, people talk about harmless hacking, is it really harmless? Responding to non-malicious or prank hacking actually uses resources. So with that in mind, it really isn't harmless. Hackers could accidentally do significant damage, and almost all hacking is a form of trespass, so it's illegal. Political hacking, which we talked about being introduced in the web period, sometimes called hacktivism, is the idea of using hacking to promote a political cause. So disagreement about whether it's in the form of civil disobedience or how it should be punished is an example. Some use the appearance of hacktivism to hide other criminal activities, though. And how do you determine whether something is hacktivism or simple vandalism? So there are different types of hackers. The three main types that people talk about are white hat or ethical hackers. These are the professionals we mentioned that can be hired, that are brought in by a company to check the level of security that they have in their network or their systems, and they're really looking at trying to better improve the system. And they're authorized, which is what makes them ethical hackers. Black hat hackers are kind of on the opposite spectrum, and these are what we're really focusing on here today, talking about crime, various forms of malicious intent. Gray hat hackers, those you don't hear discussed too much, but they can be a combination of white and black hat hackers, and they're usually looking at trying to provide national security, and because that's their focus, they're not considered as dark as black hackers, and certainly maybe not as white as a white hacker. So again, white hackers are security researchers or professionals. that are brought in specifically to improve security. So some kind of really interesting things to think about, or ethical dilemmas with regards to this. Is it ethical to break into a system without permission, even if it's with good intentions? And how can people responsibly inform potential victims of security vulnerabilities without informing malicious hackers who would actually exploit them? Hacking as a foreign policy, hacking by governments has actually increased. The Pentagon has announced it would consider and treat some cyber attacks as acts of war, and the U.S. might respond with military force. And so the United States government themselves is very interested in protecting against hacking, having white hat hackers, or as we talked about before, the gray hat hackers themselves. There's been some famous cases over the years of other countries hacking. Most recently, in the election year for President Donald Trump, talking about some of the influence or hacking that might or might not have gone on with regards to the presidential election from Russia, but certainly China. There's a lot of cyber attacks that come from China towards the United States. So because of the targets and the resources involved, some security researchers believe that these are actually coming from government agencies and not actually civilian hackers. A 2011 attack on the Gmail accounts of the White House staffers, China policy experts, military officials, human rights activists, and others originated in a Chinese city where a major Chinese national security division is located. The attack actually used email written in government jargon about the State Department reports to fool the recipients into thinking the email was authentic. And high-level government officials disclosed their passwords, allowing hackers to actually read their email for months. So this is a serious threat for many governments. So an example, one of many of hacking, and we'll look at some others later, is StruckNet. It's a kind of worm. It targeted a particular type of control system, and beginning in 2010, damaged equipment in a uranium-enriched plant in Iran. And it led to speculation that maybe the Israeli or U.S. government created it in 2012. A journalist published research indicating that the two governments did indeed produce StruckNet. Nobody really knows. And so some questions to think about when you're considering this idea of foreign policy hacking. Is cyber sabotage ever justified? Is it better than a military attack, for example, on Iran's nuclear facilities? Will China, Russia, or other governments cite this as an excuse for their own cyber intrusions into other countries? So, types of hacking, types of cyber attacks. And the first thing I'll mention is this is not a complete list by any means. There's new ones all the time being developed, but phishing, various kinds of malware we'll talk about. There's also account hijacking, denial of service attacks, DNS hijacking, and so on. So what is phishing? Phishing is where a malicious hacker tries to trick the victim into believing that there's someone they can trust in order for getting them to do some special thing. Like, for example, give them money. So one famous example of this is the Nigerian prince scam. You can click on that and read more about it down below the link. Basically, the hacker is sending out emails saying that, they're a Nigerian prince, and if you can help them, sending them a little money, they will reward you for your service by sending you more back. And so these type of phishing attacks, there's what they call phishing, is they'll send out thousands, even hundreds of thousands of these emails in order to maximize the number of intake. So kind of like fishing with a bunch of bait. Of course, it's spelled PHISING. So the biggest way to really, and kind of what I do is I never open up attachments that I don't know where they're coming from. In addition, I don't ever listen to anyone asking me for money in email in any way. I just delete it right away. In fact, frankly, I delete a lot of emails without even reading them if I don't know where they're coming from and the topic looks at all strange. It just immediately go into my trash can. So unfortunately, some of these phishing attacks can look really real, and one of the examples that help make it real is a special kind of phishing called spear phishing. And this is really targeted email. The idea is it comes from a trusted agency, or it seems to come from a trusted agency or a related individual that maybe they broke into the person's account. Here's an example of a screenshot of a spear phishing email where it looks like it's coming from a bank and it's asking you to log in, and it's basically trying to capture your login and password by doing this, and then of course it would use it to access your online accounts. So what I say here is when I get emails like from banks and stuff telling me to log in, it's not like something that I prompted, like with a reset password or something like that. What I do is I'll look first of all at the email address of where it's coming from. And what I usually do is I'll go directly to the website that I know for the actual bank, and I will, if I for some reason believe I should be doing this, go in and log in. That way I don't click on any links inside email. If I'm sure you might have gotten, even they do phone kinds of phishing where they have computerized systems that dial out and tell you it's a bank, or the IRS one is really it's so annoying. They call and leave a voicemail, and it sounds real, right? So again, if you're ever in doubt, call the agency directly. Find the number. Don't actually use the information that's being sent to you. A lot of times, most 99 point whatever. I think only one time I called, and actually it was to report because I figured it was and I got tired of getting the same one. I wanted the agency to know that there was this phishing going on. So here's another example of a spear phishing. It looks like it's coming from a Google account asking you to update it. But again, look at the email here. That looks really suspicious, at 11.account-google.com. That looks really strange. So via secureserver.net, that doesn't look like a real Google email. That being said, it's kind of easy to mimic emails that might look, and again, I would never click on this. I would go directly to my Google account or something like that if I was concerned. So malware there's a whole series of different things that are called malware. So besides phishing, this is another kind of cyber attack. It's actually a collection of them. So virus, worms, Trojan horses, rootkits, spyware, adware, and so on are some of the examples. And we'll mention a few of them. Spyware is a kind of malware that tries to basically stay hidden and collect information while you are using a browser or something like that. Keyloggers is an example of spyware, and it basically will log in the keys that you're hitting in like maybe via web forms and things like that, and try to capture logins and passwords based on what you're typing in. The only way to really avoid some of the kinds of malware out there is, is in order to remove them, for example, is having good antivirus or malware removal software and having it scan or run your system periodically. So don't ever, download attachments from people that you don't know via email. Don't click on links. Although I'm going to say, when you're browsing the web and you're clicking on things and you're kind of trying to finish things quickly and speed through, it's really hard not to click on things on websites, and you will get various kinds of malware from your browser installed, and it's the only thing to do is to have the antivirus software scan every so often. Rootkits is a special kind of malware that targets BIOS. BIOS is the software. It's at the lowest level of your computer, and it's what is used when you go through a boot up process to launch the operating system. And basically it can enslave computers into botnet. Botnet is basically a collection, a network of computers that are being controlled remotely or to basically process as they want to, or modify the data in any way they want. Virus, I've said that term before, and actually malware and virus are almost interchangeable terms. In fact, all the things that we're talking about are mostly considered viruses. But technically what a virus is any type of malware that's spread from one machine to another. So one can affect another one. Not all malware operates that way. It may be something that you have to directly download or receive, and it's not spread from one to the other. An example of a virus is, there's many, but one is called the I Love You virus. It was created by 2 Filipino programmers. Its estimated damages reached 10 billion. It affected over 10% of the world's internet computers, meaning computers connected to the internet. And basically it had an email that you asked people to click on the attachment to see a love confession. And once clicked, it actually would send itself to everyone in the user's mailing list. And it actually then went on, it downloaded and would overwrite files with itself, making the computer unbootable. Which is terrible, right? Hence the estimated damage. So another kind of malware is the Trojan horse. The definition of what this means is it infects your computer by making it think that it's a different kind of program. So the program might claim to actually be antivirus software, but it's actually maybe a keylogger or some other kind of spyware in disguise. Ransomware is a specific kind of malware that's a little more recent in time. In the last 5 years, approximately, even less. And what this does is it gets onto your computer system, again, usually as an attachment. And what it does is encrypts all or some of your data on your machine, and then it asks for a large ransom payment, asks you to pay in order to actually restore your access code. And this chart here shows you the increase in Android ransomware. So you can see it's really on the rise. An example of a case here for ransomware is called CryptoLocker. This is what it actually looked like when it got installed on your machine, and you see your personal files are encrypted and your files will be lost without payment on this particular date and time. And this is one of the first ones, by the way, and they were asking for bitcoins in order to proceed to payment. And unfortunately, it affected 500,000 victims, and they actually made upwards of $30 million in 100 days. In June, approximately a little less than a year later, they took down the leader of the gang of hackers behind CryptoLogic. And in February of that year, prior to that, prior to them actually taking them down, the FBI even offered $3 million reward for Bogachuk. All right, so cyber attack statistics. We saw a few anecdotal cases, but on average, they said in the United States, for enterprise level larger companies, the average cost is 1.3 million. So that's actually a low figure. You can look at the reference down below for the article. The average cost for U.S. small companies is 117,000, which is actually quite a bit for a small company. The global cost in 2015 was 500 billion. It's which at that time was 5 times Google's yearly cash flow, just to give you an idea of how big this is. It is on the rise. Here you can see a chart tracking it from the 2013 to 2017, giving again a total average cost. The number of attacks is on the rise, which kind of corresponds to what we're seeing with the cost. So it rose in 2017, basically almost a third. One of the biggest in 2017, for example, cyber attacks was the theft of customer records from Equifax, which was a big problem. So what type of cyber attacks are going on? Here you can see a couple different breakdowns. On the left you see for 2017 that, for example, we have, malware, POS malware making up the biggest amount. We have account hijacking taking the next amount. Targeted attacks, we have only like about 5%, almost 6% for denial of service, and so on. On the right, you can see a different breakdown. This is from Cisco, and this is looking at numbers based on some of the different things like Facebook hijacking, Android Trojans, phishing, and so on. So motivation, I think that's a bit hard to know that absolutely, but here is from hackmageddon.com, some statistics from August 2017. They have monthly reports, and you can see that crime is by far the largest, over 3/4 being crime-oriented. We have the next 10% sliver coming from espionage, warfare, and then finally hacktivism breaks down the remaining part of our 100% pie. So who's being targeted in terms of what kinds of industries? Single individuals still make up the majority. This again is in August 17 from hackmageddon.com. But you see industry, which is the next largest. Government agencies followed specifically by finance. That's separated out. And then going on down, we have healthcare and so on. And education being a little slower at 2%. So who is most likely to suffer? Basically everyone, but if you pull apart some of the different industries, you'll see financial services. Again, that could be individuals or actual finance and banks. It's a combination. trying to steal bank account information, that kind of thing. Power energy companies, telecommunication, utilities, healthcare, information technology. It's relatively balanced because at the low end you're looking at 12%, at the high end you're looking at like 19%. So really it's spread across the board. So laws and hacking, give a little bit of history. This is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or CFAA. It was passed in 1986. Its focus was trying to reduce hacking. It covers specifically government computers, financial and medical systems, and activities that involve computers in more than one state, including computers connected to the internet. So it was amended in 94, 96, and 2001 by the U.S. Patriot Act, and it basically added the definition of a loss to include the cost of responding to an attack, assessing damage, and restoring systems. So some of the items in terms of what is considered offenses in the CFAA is knowingly accessing a computer without authorization in order to obtain national security data, intentionally accessing a computer without authorization to either obtain financial records, department or agency of the United States, so again, governmental information from any protected computer that involves an interstate or foreign communication. And I'm going to let you go ahead and pause and kind of read through the rest of it. But again, some of the things that you would think of, like accessing government computer and anything dealing with affecting operations of the government, but knowingly, intent for defraud, trafficking in a password or similar information, and so on. Okay, so an example of litigation that has occurred with regards to this act was the lawsuit in 2003, Theophel versus Ferry Jones, and basically the U.S. Court of Appeals heard the case and using a civil subpoena, which is patently unlawful, bad faith, and at least gross negligence to gain access to stored email, is basically considered a breach of this act and the Stored Communications Act, which you can click on and read about. So the expansion of the CFA over years is something that needs to happen. It really predates social networks, smartphones, and so on. Some prosecutors use the CFA to bring charges against people or businesses that do unauthorized data collection. And so some questions to think about. One is violating the terms of use of a website, a crime, under CFFA's provision about exceeding one's authorized access. One of the first major crimes or cases involving the CFA involved a woman who pretended to be a 16-year-old boy on MySpace, and she started a relationship with a 13-year-old girl in her neighborhood who used to be her daughter's friend. So being, I guess, incredibly sick and mean, she broke off the relationship and sent cruel messages. She was basically torturing the girl, and the girl ended up killing herself. So this is super sad. The woman's behavior was, horrible. People wanted to see her punished, but it wasn't clear if she had broken any laws. The prosecutors charged her with illegal hacking under CFAA, and the jury convicted the woman, but a judge reversed the conviction, stating that a breach of contract is not normally a criminal offense. So penalties for hacking, and in particular young hackers. So there's this notion, and it has some truth to it, that there are young people who want to experience hacking. We talked before about harmless hacking and whether it's really hacking. Sentencing depends on the intent and damage done. Most young, underage, and of course it depends on the age. The hackers receive probation, community service, and or fines. And not until the year 2000 did a young hacker actually receive time in juvenile detention. Many young hackers have matured and gone on to productive and responsible careers. So it's really difficult to punish young hackers. I truly hope that this doesn't become more strict, because I think it's a lot about a lack of maturity. All right, so catching and preventing hacking and what can be done. So law enforcement agencies, depending on their size, will have a cyber attack team that will do everything from reading hackers' newsletters. They pretend to be hackers and different, kind of undercover. They can often track a handle by looking through archives of postings. Security professionals set up what they call honeypots, which are websites that basically attract hackers to record and study them. Computer forensics can be used to gather evidence from computers. One difficulty, of course, is the web and the internet really started a lot of open access and sharing of information and anonymity. It can make it much harder. The attitudes of people generally about security are low. People aren't overly concerned about this until it affects them. In part, there's somewhat little that you can do as an individual. You can buy anti-virus software that you run and scan and update that. You can do those general personal guidelines of not clicking on links, not clicking on attachments that you don't know, going, if you need to, directly to the original website to query about information that was sent to you. Firewalls are definitely something that you should have. Most routers today have built-in firewalls that can filter out certain kinds of communication. On other systems, not individual networks, you might have proxy servers that are application-specific ways of filtering out, of course, the antivirus software. When you're using the web for communicating, for example, buying, using your credit card, you should only buy from sites that are using SSL, secure socket layer, that uses encryption. Encrypting your data, there's a number of new companies doing special kinds of encryption software and encryption dongles that can be put into your computer so that only you can kind of unlock the computer or files or systems using that. So unfortunately, security systems and software often play catch up. Antivirus software is very much like that. It'll protect about known viruses, but something that's new, it may not. Small businesses in particular can have a larger degree of insecurity simply because buying all these systems and software can be very expensive, and they may not have the budget for it. So there was, for example, the Target security breach in 2013, and it all started with a phishing email actually sent to a small business called Fazio Mechanical, and it ended up resulting in data on 40 million credit cards being sold. stolen, and over 70 million customer records being stolen. Okay, so we kind of went over this, the issues of insecurity, can't afford staff, can be sometimes gateways to larger systems like we just talked about before. And they often will go out of business depending on how bad the breach is and the costs. So as with all our lectures, we have a series of questions. Here's the start of them. Again, you do a single post on the related discussion board for all of the questions in this lecture. So at this moment, you'll want to pause, copy them, and start to make your single posting. Identity theft is another real issue with regards to cybercrime. And identity theft is basically different crimes like the capturing of credit card numbers, social security numbers, logins and passwords, trying to basically mimic the identity of a person to gain access to accounts and things like that. It uses typically the largest demographics in terms of age is 18 to 29-year-olds because they use the web most, and they tend to be less aware of risks. And certainly with the explosion of everyone buying things on the internet, it's a lot easier to steal these numbers and use them. So how does identity theft might happen? Via phishing, maybe emails asking for information, farming, which is false websites that fish for personal data, but other places that you might not initially think of, like online resumes, job hunting sites can reveal social security numbers, things like that. So again, I even don't post my real birth dates on my social media, which can sometimes be interesting when I forget and get happy birthday notices from people, but I'm pretty cautious about putting minimal information on there. So something you might want to think about in how you post information. So how do you protect yourself? Keeping strong passwords is really important. Encrypting files is becoming more and more common these days. Using some of these security dongles. Changing your password, limiting information. But these are just a number of things, using secure SSL transactions is a big thing. One solution in the future but you do see this even on smartphones, is using biometrics. So like, for example, your fingerprint, but of course there's other things like retinal scans to authenticate who you are, so you can have access, like in the case of a phone, or to a particular file or system. Of course, any system can be fooled, but it's a lot more difficult to fool a biometric system than it is going to be something with a regular login and password. Again, you can pause and ask, copy and answer these questions again on a single post. Scams and forgeries. There's been a lot of online auction sites that are fraudulent. Some sellers don't actually send the items or send inferior products. You might have experienced this yourself. My husband recently bought something actually on Amazon and ended up getting a fake, not real version of something. So I guess it's buyer beware, which is more challenging to do these days. Some other examples: click fraud, repeated clicking on an ad can increase the site's revenue, digital forgery, using technology to create fake checks, passports, visas, various kinds of IDs, stock fraud. Common method is to buy a stock low, send out emails urging others to buy to drive the price up. All right, crime fighting versus privacy and civil liberties and the trade-offs kind of that go on. So search and seizure of computers, first of all, requires a warrant to search and seize a computer. Automated searches can monitor constantly and less likely to miss suspicious behavior. They can be programmed to only look for what is covered in a particular warrant. A particular issue of venue. Charges are generally filed where the crime actually occurs. Laws actually can be different between different states and countries, which can make it challenging. If the person is in another country and the crime occurred in America, and how that actually will work. The FBI usually files in the state where the crime was discovered and the investigation began. There's something called the Cybercrime Treaty, and this is actually an international agreement to foster cooperation amongst law officials dealing with various cybercrimes, copyright violations, pornography, fraud, hacking, and it's a way to help resolve international crimes. So that is a big issue when things happen across different countries. Here's a case: Yahoo and French censorship. At that time, Yahoo had auction sites that people could sell things. They were sued in a French court because someone was selling some kind of Nazi memorabilia, which is illegal in France and Germany. And Yahoo argued that it wasn't feasible to block access from France, and the French people could access Yahoo sites from outside France or anonymizing services. And at that time, when this happened, this is quite a while ago, geolocation was fairly new. The French court ordered Yahoo to make a serious effort to use such tools to block access by French people. And the CEO didn't go to France to attend his trial. In the end, they were acquitted because the court decided that permitting the auction site was not justifying the Nazi crimes. And the decision did not resolve the issue of whether one particular country's government could or should bring charges against someone else. And they ended up pulling down the objectionable material, of course, during that time. Applying U.S. copyright law to foreign countries and foreign companies. A Russian company sold a computer program that circumvented controls embedded in electronic books and to prevent copyright infringement. The program was actually legal in Russia but illegal in the United States. And interestingly enough, the author, Dmitry, I don't know how to say this, Skylarov, was arrested when he was in the United States. After when he arrived in the U.S. to present a talk, after protests in the United States and other country, he was allowed to return to Russia. So there's a number of cases like this where this has happened. Here's an example of arresting foreign visitors. A Russian citizen was actually arrested for violating the DMCA, which has to do with how to control digital media that we talked about before in a previous lecture. When he visited he was actually a researcher to present a paper at a conference, and the software was not illegal in Russia. He was, of course, acquitted and allowed to go back. Here's another example. This is an executive of a British online gaming site. He was arrested when he transferred planes in Dallas because we have an unlawful Internet Gaming Enforcement Act that prohibits credit card and online payment companies from processing transactions between bettors and gambling sites. And so, again, different countries can have different rules. Libel, speech, and commercial law, again, is something that can be different between different countries. Even if something is illegal in both countries, the exact law and penalties usually vary. Where a trial is held is important not just for differences in law, but also the costs associated. And freedom of speech can suffer if businesses follow laws of the most restrictive countries. Another thing to think about when considering all of this is culture. Respecting cultural differences is really not the same as respecting laws, but in some ways this can be a business decision, but how do you decide to do that and allow for freedom? You might have a particular country where the law is religious based, and they, based on that, have their own set of regulations that in other countries would be considered basic rights of freedom, and freedom of religions for minorities and things like that. And how can that come into play with what is legal in terms of the cyber world and what is not legal in different countries, and the culture surrounding that. So a solution would be to form various international agreements. There is a agency called the World Trade Organization, and the WTO has agreed to prevent their citizens from buying certain services from other countries if those services are illegal in their own. So it doesn't help, the agreement does not help when a product, service, or information is legal in one country and not in another. So there's some terms with regards to international cyber crimes. One is responsibility to prevent access, and this is the idea that publishers of content have to prevent materials or services from being accessed by other countries where they're illegal. So it's their responsibility to do this. Another term is authority to prevent entry, and that notion is a government of, let's say, country A can act within country A to try to block the entrance of material that's illegal there, but may not apply its laws to the people who create and publish the material or provide a service in a particular country B if it's legal there. So again, pause, and here are a few more questions.